This is a squirrel stew that was apparently the favourite food for America's two shortest ever serving presidents. So, let's find out what the hell squirrel tastes like. Whenever there's an election in America, my feeds get clogged up with stories about what foods each presidential candidate likes to eat. And this reminded me that both of the two shortest serving presidents both had a love of squirrel stew. One being the briefest president of all, who caught pneumonia during his own inauguration speech, and the runner-up who spent his final days on this planet being fed through his rectum. You'll be happy to know that I'm not going that far in my quest for historical recreation. But before we get into who these men were and why their presidencies were so drastically cut short, we're going to cook a meal fit for a president. I mean, as long as you live a couple of hundred years ago. So here's how you cook a squirrel stew according to a recipe from 1924. First, you need to order yourself some squirrels, unless of course you happen to live next to a taxidermy. Take a moment to marvel at the weird things you can order online these days, and let's get prepping. Our recipe starts by telling you to quarter 4 squirrels, and remove your squirrels from their plastic sarcophagus, complete with its own curse of the pharaohs. Watch out for the blood splatter. The recipe tells you to take a sharp knife and cut your squirrels into quarters, but these are honestly so tiny that cutting them into quarters just feels redundant, so I'm going to halve them. And having portioned them up, we need to prepare some onions, which I'm interpreting as baby shallots because it seems to make sense for a game stew. Though, as I always forget, these are a complete and utter faff to peel. But I remembered that there's a nifty trick to peeling these quickly. Simply smash the shallots and there we go. Self-peeling shallots. Carrot time. Top and tail your carrots, which are mercifully easy to prep in comparison. Then get your casserole dish. Layer in your squirrel meat, your shallots, your carrots, juniper berries, which I've never had in any other context than gin, so curious to see what solid gin tastes like. Crush in a couple of cloves of garlic. The next stage of the recipe is a multiple choice question. It tells us to add a glass of vinegar or a bottle of wine. Yeah, it's not really a hard choice, is it? Pour the bottle of wine into the pot. Try to avoid thinking too much about what life choices you're still making. And this stage finishes by telling you to add water enough to cover. So put a lid on your casserole in waiting and leave it in the fridge for 2 days. So the first American president who was a self-professed squirrel nut, and yes, I am proud of myself, was none other than the 20th president, James Garfield. But sadly, he never got a final chance to eat squirrel stew because he died 6 months into his presidency. So on July the 2nd, 1881, President Garfield was shot by a man called Charles Guiteau. The motive was said to have been Guiteau being passed up for a prestigious job as a French consul, which to be fair sounds like a sensible recruitment decision when you consider that he apparently, couldn't speak French. But he chose to process his feelings by shooting the President of the United States. When he shot at President Garfield, he managed to miss all of his vital organs. However, the bullet did injure his intestines. Garfield could no longer ingest food orally. His physician decided to continue to feed him, This involved administering beef extract and whiskey as an enema. Initially, they were also trying to feed him on eggs and cow's blood, but the doctors then decided to stop feeding the president eggs as they began to complain about the unspeakable farting that they felt was creating a toxic work environment. Jokes aside, the process of feeding the president rectally contributed a number of infections that ultimately led to his passing a few months after the shooting. So hopefully this stew ends up to be a decent homage for the fella. Back to the stew. After enjoying a 2-day wine bath, it's time to cook our squirrels. Bring your casserole up to the boil on your hob, then put it into a 150-degree oven for 2 hours. After 2 hours, the recipe now tells us to add suet dumplings. To make suet dumplings, I'm weighing 150 grams of self-raising flour into a bowl and adding a half teaspoon of salt. The recipe then tells you to stir through 70 grams of beef suet and add parsley if you like. Then we make a well in the center. This movement felt like a good idea at the time. Then add 3 tablespoons of cold water. Start to mix it together into a dough and then add a little bit more water until the dough is firm but pliable. We then have to divide it up into 8 equal pieces, and then when the time is ready, spread them on top of the casserole and cook for a final 30 minutes with the lid off. The other American president who was also a fan of eating secret squirrel was none other than the shortest ever serving president, William Henry Harrison. If you haven't heard of William Henry Harrison before, then it won't take you a huge amount of time to catch up on his list of presidential achievements. In 1841, William Henry Harrison became the 9th President of the United States of America. Even though he was only 68, at the time he was the oldest president ever elected, and he clearly felt he had something to prove as a result. So on the 4th of March in 1841, William Henry Harrison marched up to deliver his inauguration speech, and oh boy did he make an impression. Determined to show everyone that he was a strong and capable leader, he went out to deliver his speech on a cold, wet, rainy day without coat, gloves, hat, and proceeded to talk for what would have been a stupidly long time even for a man who was better dressed for the occasion. So Harrison finally wrapped up his speech, probably half frozen and very wet, but seemed none the worse for wear at the time. But sadly, the cold and damp took its toll, and within a month, Harrison fell seriously ill. He developed a nasty case of pneumonia, which at the time was even harder to treat than it is now. And despite the best efforts of his doctors, Harrison passed away 31 days into his presidency on 4th of April 1841. But even if he didn't manage to accomplish all the things he wanted to during his presidency, at least he showed us the benefits of a well-dressed inauguration. Now it's time to plate up our casserole. For serving suggestions, the recipe simply says, squeeze in half an orange and serve without telling your guests what they're eating. The first thing to say is that this actually smells really good. For the last few hours, my house has just smelled like a coq au vin was cooking in the kitchen, so quite curious. Let's start with a little bit of squirrel. So the squirrel itself actually tastes kind of nice. It's earthy, it's gamey, it really tastes like rabbit to me. There are two problems with it though. The first is that because we've not browned it off, there's no real depth of flavour in the sauce, and also because the recipe had no seasoning, it's crying out for some salt. There was, however, salt in the dumplings, so I'm going to try a suet dumpling. Dumpling, no problem there. It's just this squirrel which has been, I think the recipe is a bit overzealous with its cooking time. It's really stringy, it's quite overcooked. I mean, realistically, all of the fundamentals here of the stew can be improved upon. The main acid test here is, would I cook squirrel again? I mean, sure. I certainly wouldn't special order it, and no one really comes to my house for dinner anymore because of the things I cook, so yeah. So, that's my effort to try and create something light-hearted after the election taken care of.